But this building does host a couple of other pretty important events in our history, so I do want to cover some of those as well. Now, obviously, we call this building Independence Hall, and not because of the Constitution, so I'm sure somebody can tell me why. Of course, what's the thing that we give it the name Independence Hall?
The Declaration.
There we go. Yeah, that was the softball question. Wait till I get into political philosophy questions you guys have to answer today. So anyway, yes, the Declaration of Independence is written in this building July of 1776. The Articles of Confederation, if you get excited about that, are signed in this building in July of 1778. They run the Revolutionary War out of this building. But before any of those things happened, this building was already 40 years old. Most of it was built in the 1730s, and most of it dates back to the 1730s today. It was built to be the capital of Pennsylvania when Pennsylvania was still a British colony. Now, it was built, designed, and paid for by the colony of Pennsylvania because back in the 1730s, the British government in London was pretty much leaving the American colonies alone to run themselves. The people of Pennsylvania elected the guys that worked in this building. But as we get closer to our Revolutionary War, that's going to change a little bit. The British beat France in a war that we know as the French and Indian War. The European name for it is the 7 Years' War. Suddenly the British have conquered a whole lot of territory and people, not all of whom really like them. So there's a bunch of British soldiers, for example, up in Canada and out in some of the frontier areas of the West, places like Michigan, Indiana, places like that. So the British, it's suddenly costing them more money to run America, plus they had to pay for that long war. So naturally, governments that need money raise taxes. Now, they already paid a lot of taxes over there in England, but we here in America weren't paying any taxes across the ocean. And so they realized there's like close to 3 million taxpayers over here that probably ought to be paying some taxes. So they came up with something called the stamp tax, put a tax on papers and legal documents, that sort of thing. Which kind of tax exists today? I pay a fee every 4 years to get a new driver's license. It's the same kind of idea. So at any rate, Americans didn't like this. Well, not all of them, at least. Some Americans were like, oh, whatever, governments make taxes. And Ben Franklin, you guys have all heard of Ben Franklin. He once said that in life, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. We're all going to die, we're all going to pay taxes. But when this tax came from London, and nobody in America voted for that government in London, because the king doesn't make the taxes, it is the Parliament, the House of Commons, that does, Americans would say this was, of course, taxation without
representation.
Right. And that made it illegal. A law passed without our consent is illegal, because as a British subject, one of your rights, going back like 500 years to the Magna Carta, slowly is that right that the people were in charge. But here in America, we were in charge locally, but not, had no say in London. So anyway, things keep getting worse. Protests, tea is destroyed in Boston, but other places too. In Maryland, they burned an entire ship just to destroy the tea. Boston always seemed like the troublemaking area, so they passed some laws to punish them called the Coercive Acts, or in the Americans we call them the Intolerable Acts. They shut down the local government and the local courts of Massachusetts, at which point other colonies started saying, hey, if they did that to them, they could do that to us. And Virginia's government called for a meeting here in Philadelphia of these different colonies. And of course, this group of men would be known as the Continental. 1799. And that's what this building was. This was Pennsylvania's capital. The governor worked upstairs. We had one house back then, one house of legislature called the Assembly. They were across the hall. And the Pennsylvania Supreme Court was in here. So all the branches of our government were right in this building. This was actually one of the biggest buildings in America when it was first built, and I know you weren't standing outside looking at our bell tower thinking skyscraper, but in a way, in the 1740s and 50s, that's kind of what it was. Now, the nice thing about the building today for us is it's the original building. So when you look at these walls, all this wood carving up there, most of that is original. Because of that, we have places where we have 200 or more years of paint on the walls. So to find out the original colors, they went through those one at a time, 30 or more layers of paint to find the old colors. So one thing I can tell you is, back then, this room was orange. Now, why it was orange, your guess is as good as mine, but this is the color that they used, at least as close as we can match it. And you'll notice that every room is painted a different color in this building. Probably just to make it a little bit more showy. The other problem we run into, the paint we could figure out, furniture we kind of had to guess. Nobody saved anything. They kept using this building. When our state government moves out to Harrisburg, the city buys this and it becomes City Hall. City Council of Philadelphia meets on the second floor of this building until 1895. Such a historic building as this, still being used as a government building not much more than 100 years ago. The first floor will become a museum in the early, middle 1800s. And our goal with the Park Service is that you see it the way it looks. So based on all the research, we have a good idea the type of furniture they have, but nothing really got saved. So all these things, books, tables, desks, chairs, etc., are from that time, from the late 1700s. They're the right style, but there's no way we'll ever know what was where and when, except for one thing in this room. Now you guys from Harrisburg ought to be able to identify this. What's that painting on the wall showing us? Yeah, it's on our flag. It's our state seal, exactly. That's exactly what we use to represent Pennsylvania. And of course, this was the Capitol building. So in this room today, the only thing I can 100% definitely say is exactly where it used to be, is that painting. It was painted to hang right there. And it's painted in the year 1785. So when they were sitting across the hall writing our Constitution, every time they walked in and out of that room, that's what they saw. But here's kind of an interesting fact. You have a question?
Yeah. Is that the real table that
Well, again, well, first of all, this is not the room for the Declaration yet. And remember, I said these things are all from that age, but not necessarily from this building. So it could have been used here in the building back then, but we just don't know. That's our problem. I wish I could tell you it was, but we don't really know, so I would say probably not. So let's go back to 1775. What country were we a part of in 1775? Britain. We're British. We had a king. The symbol of King George was hanging on the wall of this courtroom. The symbol of King George survived on the wall of this courtroom until July of 1776, at which point I'm sure it was just an accident, but somehow it caught fire. So I don't have the King's coat of arms to show you anymore, but Pennsylvania eventually put their own up there. And that was the change. We went from a British colony to a free state. And we got there when the Continental Congress across the hall started off, one, creating an American army. I'm sure somebody can tell me who they picked to be the commander of their army. One of you guys from Seattle, you might know this. What's the name of your state?
Washington.
So the guy, yeah, there you go. You know that. So yes, right across the hall, the first big thing they're ever going to do is create an American army and pick George Washington to lead it. That turns out to be one of the most important decisions they'd ever make in this building. Now the question is, what are they fighting for in 1775? Because it's not independent until July of 1776. So what are they fighting for? Not really taxes. Bigger. Closer. Short word, starts with R. It's not my left, it's my... Yeah, their rights. Their rights to be able to vote, to have a say when those tax laws are passed. Their right to have a fair trial. Because in Boston, they closed the courts. You don't get a jury of your peers when your trial is not in Massachusetts, but is in Canada. You don't have a say in voting when some other government across the ocean makes laws, changes your judges, changes your governor. So Americans are fighting to protect their rights. They're writing letters to King George asking him to help, but he never answers. But now, of course, once the war gets started, the British wanted to go away. So they're going to send over a proclamation to America. Gets here in January of 1776. It says, anyone involved in this rebellion is a traitor. So let me ask you, if I'm tried in a British courtroom, I stand in the prisoner's dock. still use this today, a lot of times a wooden box. I have a lawyer, I get a jury, I have a public trial, I'm even innocent until proven guilty, even though I'm in a cage. But if I am found guilty after all of that of being a traitor, what do you think my punishment's going to be back then? Yeah, rope around the neck, death by hanging. So if you're sitting across that hall in January 1776, that is really something for you to think about. But these guys aren't ready to just give up and go home. They are worried about those rights of theirs to the point where they start talking about independence. By June, they've picked out 5 men to write that Declaration of Independence. The committee: Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, worked for about a month. Whenever they voted, every state got 1 vote. And they almost always go in order from north to south, so north is left for you guys. So New Hampshire in the front, Massachusetts in the back are our northern states. South Carolina in the front, Georgia in the back are our southern states. That's sort of the best order. So since we have a lot of Pennsylvania, this is probably us right here in the middle. Now, for the Constitutional Convention, it started with George Washington. He had a meeting in his house in Virginia. He wrote a letter saying it's time for us to decide if we are one people or if we are 13 continuously counteracting each other. In other words, one country or 13 little ones always fighting. Obviously, he wants us to be one. So the meeting in Mount Vernon is Maryland and Virginia, who've been fighting for years. They sit down and they figure out an agreement. They say, this is great. We should have a bigger meeting. So the next year it was Maryland. They got 5 states to sit down, but that's not good enough. They wanted everybody. So in 1787, 3 years and a half or so after the war, they're going to sit down in this room. Now they did not get Rhode Island. So the middle table over here, we usually guess it's Rhode Island in 1776. There's nobody here that summer. New Hampshire, they don't show up till real late. And New York, they leave real early because they don't like the stuff that's going on in here. Except for one New Yorker. Alexander Hamilton's going to stick around. He can't officially represent New York because he's just one guy. But he stays and takes a big part in writing that Constitution. Now, Virginia down here came with a plan from the very beginning. In fact, James Madison, who'd eventually be our 4th president, is one of the guys behind it. 3 branches of government. But Virginia, those guys agree that states aren't really all that important. What's important is that we're American. So whenever we vote, it should be based on that. Now, Delaware had come into the beginning of the meeting with one instruction. Anything you do has to have every state have an equal vote, or we do not agree in Delaware. Now, Pennsylvania, looking at Delaware, well bigger Pennsylvania looking at tiny little Delaware, saying, that's not fair for a big state like us. So suddenly this feud between big and little states is going to start. New Jersey puts out their own plan that says every state should be equal whenever we vote. For more than a month, they're going to go back and forth on this question, off and on, trying to figure out how we can do this. Some guys don't think we'll be able to find an answer. But fortunately for us, the men in this room knew they had to do something, even if they hadn't quite figured it all out. And Connecticut down here would eventually figure out a compromise. In fact, we call it the Great Compromise today. That gives us a Senate where every state is equal. That's good for New Jersey. And a House of Representatives based on the number of people that you have. That's good for Pennsylvania. Now, neither side particularly love it, but they both get a little bit of what they want, so they can kind of live with it and move forward. And this is how it's going to go. Let's talk about president. Alexander Hamilton over here, he wants a really strong president. So he says we should elect one guy, and that guy should be president for the rest of his life. Now, having just separated from our king, not a real popular call. James Madison's original plan, a little bit closer to what we know. One president, 7 years, with no re-election. So one 7-year term, and that's it. Now, the big difference in this one is, when the president is elected, he is elected by Congress. And then some people started saying, not Congress, how about just the Senate would elect the president? So that can A little bit different than what we know. Now, you want to get real different. Another Virginian, Edmund Randolph, put out a suggestion of not even having one president at all, but rather having 3 at the same time. Think of the ads around Election Day if you triple the number of candidates. So thank heavens we don't do that. Now, here's the thing at the end. How many presidents do we have, guys? You know this. 1. Do you know how many years?
Well, 4 years, and then there's another election, and then they can, if they win, they can do another 4-year term, and then do more than that.
That's right, and that's an amendment too. So, but we'll get to amendments later. So yes, very good. You can do the tour. Maybe I'll come on the other now. So yes, 1 4-year term, and then you have to run again. And who elects the president?
Everybody, just everybody.
Sort of, right. But yes, basically we the people elect the president, but then we have that electoral college. Part of that is so those small states still have a say. That's part of, again, trying to find these things that'll make all the states like this. Now, of course, here's the big ticket topic. Slavery. They do talk about it in this room. Gouverneur Morris, your main author of your Constitution, is basically saying this is the time to get rid of it. Well, down here in the South, we don't want to talk about it. So they're kind of like, hey, we'll walk out and go home if you go down that road. And for the men in this room, priority number 1, all 13 states. Even if they're not all in the meeting, they want all 13 states to agree. So we can't have the South going off on their own. So they say, okay, we'll put it aside for 20 years. We hope we can figure it out 20 years when we're more stable. Obviously, we all know that's not going to happen. It's going to cause this endless number of problems for the next century, but that's another tour for another day. So here's the thing. They start coming to agreements, but they're not in love with this thing. There are 2 different 5-man committees that write our Constitution. The first one is called the Committee of Detail. And guess what? It's exactly what it sounds like. The guys putting in all the details of our government. 3 of those guys would end up on the United States Supreme Court, and 1 of them would be our first Attorney General. So that's the sort of guys on this Committee of Detail. But 1 of them who's going to end up on that Supreme Court is a Pennsylvanian named James Wilson. And he begins their report, he writes it out with the words, "We the people." Now that's it, we the people, and then he goes on. So once they agree to everything they want in there, then it's another 5 guys called the Committee of Style. Now they got a kind of cooler name to start with, but they're the guys who are going to write out all the words. The main author, a wooden-legged Pennsylvanian by the name of Gouverneur Morris. So when you read the rest of that, we the people of the United States in order to form a more perfect union, so on, that's whose words you're reading, Gouverneur Morris. So the Constitution is written September the 15th, 1787. They've pretty much agreed to everything. So they say, okay, let's handwrite it all out. We'll also print it up because we got to send it out to all the states. All the states have to vote on it. And then the handwritten one comes back, they check it out, looks like it's okay. So September the 17th rolls around, the last day. One last bit of business, they're going to discuss the House of Representatives. They're going to change it from 1 representative for every 40,000 people to 1 representative for every 30,000 people. So last little bit of business. And then it's time to sign. But again, here's the thing. There are guys in here that aren't sure. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, signer of the Declaration of Independence, will refuse to sign the Constitution because he doesn't think it's going to work. He thinks there's too much democracy. And what he means by that is it's too likely that we'll have these fighting parties with each other and it'll result in some kind of civil war. That's his fear. 3 guys in all that are in the room on that day will not sign their names on. And other guys aren't sure they want to as well. So Benjamin Franklin came in that day with a speech. He knew this. He anticipated it. Franklin was 81 years old. He literally was carried in and out of these meetings that summer. He started off his speech saying, there are things in this Constitution I do not approve. Now that doesn't sound like the way to get you to sign it. But then he says 2 nice words at the end of that. He says, at present. He says, I'm old enough to know I've been wrong, I've changed my mind, I'm not perfect, and neither are my ideas. Something that I liked one day I might not like later. And he's far and away the oldest and wisest man in this room, so you got to listen to when he's talking. He says to everyone, nobody else in this room is perfect either. So he says, I think we should all sign this Constitution. He would say, I am not sure that this is not the best. But he says, I can't think of anything better either. So, how do you argue with Ben Franklin? The bulk of these men who cast aside their doubts walk up here, sign their names on the U.S. Constitution, September the 17th, 1787, 226 years ago, almost right now probably. As they're signing, Ben Franklin's going to point to the front of the room. Now, I've got exactly one piece of furniture in this room that I can definitely tell you was in this room on that day 226 years ago, and it would be this chair right here. In fact, it was right here on this spot. In fact, George Washington was sitting in it that day. This was his chair. He ran that meeting all summer. He sat up here and led these men as they wrote our Constitution. And as they're signing their names, Benjamin Franklin points to the chair, and he says, look behind George Washington's head. Get a little bit of light on it there. You make it out a bit. There's a carving of a half-sun. And Franklin says, all summer, he's been trying to decide whether this sun there was supposed to be going up, going down. You really can't tell. It's just sort of sitting right there on the horizon. But he says, now he's decided. He says, now at length I have the happiness to know that is a rising and not a setting sun. Felt good. Well, let's see. A little bit of math to finish up with. 226 years to the day later. Fact number one, we are using that same Constitution right now. Fact number two, we are using the same government that they designed with that Constitution right now. Fact number three, that same Constitution that we haven't really had to throw out and start over again has also allowed us to grow. Because let's think of two things that Constitution has done for us in the past 226 years. Number one, it ended slavery. That's how slavery will end in the United States. Not the Civil War, but the Constitution. 13th Amendment, 1865, forever outlaw slavery in the United States. How about women? They didn't even talk about women in this room, let alone putting them aside. It just didn't even occur to them. And in fact, it's going to take 55 years after slavery before we even get to women. Apologize for that part. But anyway, it would be the 19th Amendment of 1920 that gives women the right to vote. So that, to me, is one of the other great triumphs of these men, that we have been able to keep on growing without having to completely start over again through the last couple hundred years.